A fiery object streaks across 6 states and reportedly crash lands near a small town in Pennsylvania.
There was something down in the woods that was of great importance to our government and military for the military to respond the way it did.
In Spain, an amateur astronomer sees a bizarre glowing object from his rooftop. It's also picked up on radar in Portugal, sending the media into overdrive.
It was impossible not to notice because everyone was talking about it.
And in Vietnam, a U.S. military camp is plunged into darkness as a mysterious bright light appears in the sky.
It couldn't have been anything that we could reasonably come up with that could do what it did.
Does anyone know what these phenomena are? And do the governments of the world know more than they ever reveal to us? The answers may lie in the fascinating stories of UFO conspiracies. It's almost 50 years since this small rural community became the center of a bizarre and controversial event. In the decades since, life has returned to normal here. But for many of the people in these parts, the events of that night are unfinished business. Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, December 9th, 1965. It's just getting dark when multiple witnesses see a fiery object race across the sky. Some report that as it flies overhead, it changes course. Ronnie Struble is at home in nearby Greensburg when he spots the fireball. Ronnie's been a fireman for almost 40 years, but it's still the strangest thing he's ever seen.
At that point in time, I would have thought that, it could have been a plane, a Piper Cub or something like that that could have been on fire and went down.
Whatever the object is, the news spreads that it has come down in the woods near Kecksburg. Meanwhile, factory worker Bill Weaver is driving near town.
I was 19 years old, and at that age, you're out just riding around.
Reports are coming in that something has come down in the woods northeast of town.
The word got around that something had landed in Kecksburg.
Bill turns his car around and races off to investigate. Almost 50 years on, this quiet country road still holds vivid memories for him.
When I got here, it was almost dark, and we were looking down into the woods, and we could see that blue light. It was like a welder. We couldn't see from my vantage point exactly what it was. You could see that something went down through there, that the trees and the shrubbery was tore up.
It's not long before people start gathering at the site. The news is spreading fast. Local radio station WHJB is inundated with calls from listeners. Stan Wall is the DJ on shift that evening. He still runs a radio station in the area today.
All of a sudden, my phone line started to light up and people were calling in and saying, "Are you aware of something peculiar happening in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania tonight?"
The station's news reporter, John Murphy, grabs his tape recorder and heads to Kecksburg. He's not alone. Within hours, the state police and the military are on the scene. When Ronnie Struble arrives from Greensburg, he finds the roads blocked.
We've seen khaki-type military men walking about. As to whether they were Army or Navy or whatever, we couldn't tell.
Stan Gordon has spent the last 40 years researching the case.
Various independent people have gone on public record and stated that soldiers actually stopped them and aimed their weapons at them to prevent them from going further down into the woods.
Bill and the rest of the locals are moved away, and the area is sealed off.
Then the state police and the military come up. They told us that we had to move. They told me to move my car, and if I didn't, that they would confiscate my car.
It's early evening by the time WHJB reporter John Murphy arrives at the scene. Like any good journalist, Murphy wants a closer look. Although he died in 1969, he described the events of that night to his colleague, Stan Wall.
He viewed it, but it was from a distance. And he said it was something that was a cone-shaped form.
Some later accounts claim that Murphy gets close enough to take a series of photographs. But allegedly, he is stopped by officials.
John did mention that some of the equipment that he had, that he used that night, were no longer in his possession. He said that they were taken away from him.
Murphy then starts to interview witnesses and calls into his radio station to go live with the story.
He said, "Stan, you will not believe this." But he said, something happened out here tonight that is beyond question. He said, something landed here in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania.
Curiosity is further heightened when a truck reportedly leaves the area several hours later, carrying a large covered object on the back.
What happened was they came in and took the object away, and the object was covered up with a tarp, and no one actually saw what was under that tarp.
Yet, upon completion of their search, state police and military officials tell residents they have found absolutely nothing.
As early as the next day, the official explanation comes out in the media that people had been mistaken, that nothing had been found in the woods, that there was indeed a search, but nothing was found.
You just can't take the multitude of these people and say, well, nothing happened. It was just a fragment of your imagination.
Bill, Ronnie, and many of the other eyewitnesses suspect a government cover-up. Stan Gordon has spent decades trying to discover exactly what happened that night.
There was something down in the woods that apparently was of great importance to our government and military for the military to respond the way it did.
But what was it? December 9th, 1965. People witness a bright object streak across the early evening skies of Pennsylvania. The Federal Aviation Administration received 23 reports from pilots about the fireball. A mystery object is reported to crash land near the small town of Kecksburg. Locals are kept out of the site, while the military and state police conduct a search.
Officially, of course, the next day the report came out that nothing was found, and in fact it was just a bright meteor in the sky, that people had been mistaken.
Witnesses Bill Weaver and Ronnie Struble believe that what they saw that night was no meteor. Astronomer James McGahey has spent his career watching the skies.
Now, it is a fact that on a daily basis, all kinds of space debris, that is, rocks, dust, crystals, hit the Earth's atmosphere, millions of these things a day. In the case of Kecksburg, you have a situation where people saw a bright light in the sky, and then many people in the towns of Kecksburg thought this had landed nearby and went out to look for it. But you have a classic case of a fireball meteor.
Like the Chelyabinsk meteor of 2013, the fireball in Pennsylvania was well documented by the scientific community and was spotted by multiple witnesses.
When you have something very bright, very impressive. It always appears to be closer. The reality is that in most of the time, it's probably hundreds of miles away. It's not nearby.
But Stan Gordon is not convinced.
Now, many of the people I've interviewed said that whatever this object was, it was moving relatively slowly. Indications are that it may change in direction along its path, and when it came down into the woods, it did not come down at a high rate of speed, but this came down almost like it was controlled.
As far as it being a meteor theory, I don't think that's possible because of the way the pattern is now known that it came down. It was a zigzag pattern, and meteors do not do that.
Astronomer and science writer Professor Nigel Henbest is familiar with how meteors behave.
A meteor can't change direction, so when we have reports here that it seemed to go in a different direction, then that can't actually have happened. But on the other hand, there is a psychological effect that if you move your head while you're watching a meteor, the meteor can seem to change direction. And I've certainly seen that myself. If a bright shooting star catches the corner of my eye and I turn my head around, swivel around, take a look, the meteor will seem to change its direction because my head is turning.
But what some people report seeing on the ground that night looks nothing like a chunk of space rock. Several witnesses independently give similar descriptions of the object, which they say landed in the woods.
A number of local people went down into the woods and came across this large, metallic, acorn-shaped object semi-buried in the ground. The object they saw appeared to be one solid piece of metal. There was no rivets, no weld marks, no seams. On the back of the object was this raised up area, something like a rim or a ringed area. One witness actually calls it a bumper area that was maybe about 8 to 10 inches wide. And raised up on that surface were these unusual markings. And in fact, one witness, after seeing this, spent years in libraries trying to find what type of language might be similar. And he said the closest thing he could find was ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics.
A life-size model of the object today stands outside Kecksburg Fire Station. The model and the incident divide the town, with many people still reluctant to talk about it.
People wanted to hush this up. It was like you were a communist. If you were talking about this, you were against your government. You know, if you even spoke about it.
So most of these people said, hey, we're just going to keep our mouth shut. We're not going to get involved.
One person determined to uncover the truth is local reporter John Murphy, one of the first people at the scene. Stan Wall worked with Murphy at WHJB Radio.
John was going to do a documentary on what really went on in Kecksburg. And he was going to air the program. I think it was an hour program that John had planned to put on the air.
A few days before the show is broadcast, 2 men in suits turn up at the radio station demanding to see Murphy. Witnesses claim that these men identify themselves as government employees.
They went into the newsroom. The newsroom was separate from the main studios in which I was broadcasting from. And the doors closed, and John was in there with the military. And John came in to me about maybe an hour or two after they left. He said, we have to pull this. We are not going to air the program. I asked him why, and he said, let's just leave it at that. We're not going to do it, and don't ask me any more questions.
Despite the visit from the 2 men, Murphy insists he was not pressured to change his program in any way.
John was visibly shook up. He was really scared. I think he was scared, really, at that time. Very scared to go divulge more into the story.
Nobody knows what was said in that room. What did they have to hide? December 1965. A fiery object reportedly crash lands near Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. Locals witness a large military presence, and some claim to see a metallic object in the woods. In the mid-1980s, a Project Blue Book report on the Kecksburg event comes to light. The U.S. Air Force set up Project Blue Book in 1947 to investigate UFO sightings. By the time the project closes in 1969, they have over 700 reports classified as unidentified.
During my search for documents on the Kecksburg case, the only official government document on the Kecksburg incident which has shown up was part of the Air Force Project Blue Book files. But there was one handwritten memo that really stood out and was very interesting, and it indicated that a 3-man team has been dispatched to investigate and pick up an object.
But witnesses on the scene report a different story.
There was a lot more military than just 3 Air Force personnel. Many, many people tell us about a rather large military presence of what appeared to be Army personnel and equipment.
This apparent incompleteness of official accounts has led researchers to ask a simple but arresting question. Are the authorities hiding something? Did something fall from space? And does that mean its origin was extraterrestrial?
Earth orbit is absolutely chockers with human material. So it's a little bit surprising, perhaps, to think that there might be human artifacts that re-enter the atmosphere.
Dr. Alice Gorman studies man-made objects in space. She's one of the world's first space archaeologists.
There are millions of tiny fragments, literally millions. We have a huge range, uncountable number of little bits of stuff ranging up to satellites that are tens of thousands of kilograms, the size of houses and buses up there.
In December 1965, NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, tracks Cosmos 96, a damaged Soviet spacecraft.
The Cosmos 96 was a spacecraft that had originally been designed to go to Mars, but they decided they would divert it for a Venus flyby mission, meaning that they would launch it towards Venus and it would fly by, make observations, and then fly off into the rest of interplanetary space. But when they launched it, the actual platform started to break up and it started to re-enter the atmosphere.
It plummets back to Earth, landing somewhere in North America on December 9, 1965, the same day as the Kecksburg event. Could the Cosmos 96 spacecraft be what the witnesses saw in Pennsylvania?
Well, for me, one of the things that's really fascinating about this case is the description that the people in Kecksburg gave of it as being acorn-shaped. Now, you can go onto the web and you take a look at the early series of Venus probes that the Russians launched, and they are acorn-shaped. And I'm very intrigued about these reports of hieroglyphic lettering going around the base. Obviously, if it's a natural object, you're not going to have any kind of a lettering on it. But if they were maybe Russian Cyrillic script, then to somebody in America not knowing the language, those perhaps could look like hieroglyphs.
In 1965, Cold War tensions between the US and the Soviet Union were high. If the US did retrieve a piece of Russian space technology, it would have been a priceless piece of intelligence. Could it be that the Air Force intentionally released misleading information to cover up their find?
I think the government would use any excuse to cover this up for whatever their reason. I don't know exactly what their reasoning is behind the cover-up, but they're making up stories.
But there's a snag in the Cosmos explanation.
So there was the obvious presumption that maybe what they'd seen was the Cosmos 96 re-entering. However, all of the available data on its re-entry suggests that it actually had come back down about 13 hours earlier.
The data also appears to show that the Soviet spacecraft broke up in the atmosphere over Canada, hundreds of miles from Kecksburg. With a question mark hanging over the Cosmos 96 theory, what happened in Kecksburg in 1965 remains unexplained. For almost 50 years, witnesses and investigators are frustrated by a lack of solid information from official sources.
My feeling after interviewing many people and looking at this for many years is that, one, we're either dealing with some type of very secretive man-made space probe that has some type of re-entry control capability, or we're dealing with something that's extraterrestrial.
To date, NASA and the military insist that all that was seen by the people of Kecksburg that night was a passing meteor.
I think it's something that it's going to go on for many years until somebody's willing to give us information to back up what happened here in Kecksburg.
Do I believe that something happened? Yes. I think that the people in the area are owed an explanation as to what happened, that they were not crazy that night.
To the people that say that nothing happened, I'll say to them, either they weren't there or they're just plain out lying.
A major capital city, home to 3 million people, and in 2004, the setting for a remarkable incident. Madrid, Spain. On the night of June 1st, amateur astronomer and science student Jesus Merchan Ribera is on the roof of his apartment building, enjoying the fine weather and the clear night skies.
I was preparing my equipment to do some photographs of a comet, back then, NEAT comet.
It's while setting up to photograph the comet that Jesus sees what he initially assumes to be an ordinary aircraft moving from north to west.
I look at it just the same way as any other plane, but then it started to expel dust and to create a dust cloud in the sky. It was very large and yellow. And then the object began to rotate, to turn over itself and to go upwards, like in a erratic trajectory. And I started to get worried because I thought it was a plane crash. I was very scared because I think those people were about to die, and I was witnessing that.
And then the object appears to explode.
That time I have my camera ready, and I took the picture, the only picture that I managed to take.
This is the image that he took that night.
When the whole event was over, I phoned a friend of mine to have him check the news to see if a plane crash has taken place. But we didn't find anything about that or about anything. It was like it never existed.
But as it turns out, Jesus was not the only person to see the object that night. Over 360 miles away in Beja, Portugal, Jorge Fernandez is out hunting.
Around 11 p.m., I finished hunting and headed back towards the truck. On my way back there, I looked towards the mountains and I saw smoke from something falling very fast. I got scared. I thought it was a plane that was about to crash. I watched it for a few seconds. Suddenly, it stopped in the air. It just hovered there, still. A strong light came on, as if there was an explosion inside the smoke. There was always smoke around it.
Nearby, in the town of Aljustrel, graphic designer Pedro Pinheiro also claims to see a bizarre phenomenon in the sky that night.
I saw a triangular shape, and in one of the corners there was a more intense light. It was a bluish-white color, and it was moving slowly at a constant speed.
Pinheiro is astonished by what he's seeing.
I got a bit scared. I'd never seen anything like that. So I called my brother and his girlfriend, and they came running out, and we just watched it in silence, totally speechless.
Being a graphic designer, but not having a camera to hand, Pinheiro comes up with a novel way of documenting the incident.
This is an illustration I made the next day, and it shows what I saw in the first few moments, the very first time I looked up at it in the sky.
It's not just ordinary citizens who say they witnessed the strange bright object. The sighting is also confirmed by radar, leading to an official study by the Portuguese Air Force. Francisco Mourão Correa is a Portuguese UFO investigator.
At least 2 different air bases in Portugal, Montijo and Beja, captured the object on radar. And later, also the civilian tower, air tower in Porto, that also captured the object.
This official evidence sends the media into overdrive.
Intense, white, surrounded by smoke, without sound.
The 2004 sighting was widely spoken across all the media in Portugal, TVs, newspapers, radios, because it was such a big event seen from the north to south.
And as more photographs and accounts of the strange phenomenon surface, there is little doubt that something unusual passed through the skies that night.
Some people were panicking. They called the Civilian Protection Agency, they called police departments, they called the fire departments, because they wanted answers.
Just what was it that people were seeing? Jesus Merchan Rubira, an amateur astronomer, sees a strange object over Madrid in 2004, which is witnessed by others across Spain and Portugal. He sees it when he's attempting to photograph a comet. But could it be that the object he saw was in fact the comet he was looking for? He just didn't recognize it.
It wasn't possible at all that this object was the comet I was looking for, because the comet was in the other point of the sky, because the comet was very, very far away. So I was sure it wasn't the comet.
With his interest in astronomy, it's hard to imagine that Jesus wouldn't recognize the comet he was looking for. So what else could the strange lights have been? Astronomer and science writer Professor Nigel Henbest has noticed a vital clue.
This object was also picked up on radar, which gives us an indication that it was launched from low down in the Earth's atmosphere, not something coming from extraterrestrial space.
And based on the images and descriptions of the event, another theory emerges.
There are other things that can cause a trail of light in the sky, in this case definitely going upwards, and that will be a missile being launched, a rocket or a missile. You see the bright ball of light from the rocket's exhaust and then a trail of the exhaust gases going out behind it.
So could the object in the sky over Spain and Portugal really be a missile? Hard evidence has come to light that supports this theory.
On the night of June the 1st, the French actually launched a missile from a submarine off the coast of Brittany, an M45 sea-to-ground missile.
This communique from the French Navy confirms there was a missile test flight that night.
They launched a missile targeted towards French Guiana in South America, so that missile launched from Brittany would actually have gone over both Spain and Portugal en route. So I think this case is pretty well sewn up. It was that particular missile.
But despite the evidence for the French naval test, some of the people involved with the case refused to believe that what they saw was a missile.
I don't think that even a missile is able to stop suddenly and then change direction and start going up. I don't think it's possible.
From what I have seen of missiles on the news or in films, I don't think what I saw that night corresponds in any way to a missile.
I did not see it. I cannot say, based only on the several witness accounts, it's strange that it would be a missile.
So in the face of what appears to be compelling evidence, why are some witnesses unconvinced? Could it be that what some people thought they saw was different to what actually happened? Dr. Bo Lotto is a neuroscientist who studies how we perceive the world around us.
When we open our eyes, we never see the world that's really there. We can't. We're forever separate from that world. We only ever receive information from that world onto our senses. So onto our eyes, into our ears, onto our skin. That's the only information we get. So your brain can only ever use its history of experience to make sense of that information, to literally make sense. That then shapes our assumptions. So in a sense, we see what we believe. We see what our assumptions are.
Which means some people might be more likely to think they've seen a UFO than others.
So you can be self-priming. You can prime yourself to see something. We all know this to be true. So if suddenly you want to buy a car and you're interested in buying one particular car, you'll notice that car everywhere. Suddenly, your brain over-biases the probability of those cars existing in the world, even though, of course, nothing's changed. It's just because you're noticing them more.
Many times when I'm out in the fields, I wish that I could see a UFO. And it happened on that night.
The point is that they're not crazy. Their brain is simply making a meaning based on what makes most sense. So they're giving it an interpretation that makes sense. What makes sense for them is specific to them.
So it's not surprising some people believe that what they saw that night was not a missile. In the end, what a witness sees comes down to what they want to believe.
The simplest explanation is usually the correct one. So for me, the case is closed. Yeah, with this missile test, I am comfortable with this hypothesis.
But not all cases are so easily explained.
I think it came from the west and just stopped and went up a ways, came down a ways, and zigged back and forth a ways, and then it just went, I would say, at a 45-degree angle. Just gone that fast.
Today, this corner of Southeast Asia is a tourist mecca. Sun-seekers and backpackers flock to the miles of sandy beaches and luxurious resorts. But 50 years ago, the visitors were here for a very different reason. Nha Trang, in what was then South Vietnam. Late June 1966, and America is deeply involved in the Vietnam War. By the end of the year, around 400,000 U.S. military personnel will be on the ground. The Air Force and Army bases at Nha Trang are vital footholds for U.S. operations. One of the American soldiers there at the time was Wayne Dalrymple, now a retired sergeant.
I was in Vietnam from 1966 to 67. I spent a year and a half there. The unit I was with was a supply company, and I was a truck driver in that supply company. And we drove from there to Cam Ranh Bay to pick up supplies, and we delivered supplies up and down the coast.
Dalrymple vividly remembers a remarkable event that occurred one evening as he joined a group of off-duty soldiers enjoying some R&R.
It was 8:30 at night, and there was a screen set up to show movies when we could get them. And they were showing a movie, and I pulled the truck in and parked it right behind the last row of seats there. It was kind of like a drive-in.
But the movie is about to get an unscheduled intermission.
And that's when the generators went out, and of course we didn't realize anything else had gone out right away.
It's not just their movie projector that stopped. Across the base, the generators are silent, and the backups aren't kicking in.
Just everything within earshot, everything was dead quiet. There was nothing running. And we just got up, started wandering around, and we realized some other stuff had stopped running, and there was a guy coming into camp with a Jeep, and his Jeep stopped right in the middle of the road, and that's when we got wondering what the heck is going on.
And the power outage isn't confined to the base. It's down as far as the eye can see.
We realized everything else was out too. We could walk around the end of a couple of the tents there and look up on the mountain and see that there was no lights up there operating. So we figured something weird is going on.
In the middle of the blackout, Dalrymple's tale gets even stranger.
And it was just a minute or two after that when this bright light appeared in the sky. I think it came from the west and just came right straight over, kind of about halfway between the mountaintop and where we were, and just stopped. And went up a ways, came down a ways, and did that a couple of times, and zigged back and forth a ways, and kind of looked like a white sun, if you can picture a white sun. It just lit up the whole area just like daytime from basically pitch black. And it just went, I would say, at a 45-degree angle. Just gone that fast. And things powered back up again.
Could the blackout and this mysterious, silent, fast-moving light be linked? Nick Pope, formerly of the UK's Ministry of Defence, has studied the case.
What was extraordinary about these Nha Trang sightings was the effect that the UFO seemed to have on equipment. It was as if all power sources at the military base were somehow adversely affected by this UFO.
One vital record of this incident is written by Dalrymple himself.
I had written home to my mother and had told her, I don't know, a day or two later when I'd written home, you know, you're always looking for something to say besides what's going on. And I had told her about it.
In this letter, he documents the UFO sighting and actually sets out what he and probably hundreds of other people at the base saw. One of the other critical pieces of evidence comes from the National Archive and consists of a confirmation from the original base records that there were indeed blackouts that affected the base at this exact time.
Dalrymple's letter suggests that he and his friends aren't the only ones rattled by the events that night.
Sergeant Dalrymple describes how a plane load of senior officials flew in shortly afterwards to investigate. To me, this is standard procedure. An investigation, not maybe into the UFO sighting, but certainly into the loss of power, will have been ordered immediately.
We talked about what it could have been and what it couldn't have been. And it couldn't have been anything that we could reasonably come up with that could do what it did.
But it would appear that there was no investigation at the time into the connection between the blackout and the light that Dalrymple saw.
We don't have a case file in the way that, for example, Project Blue Book documents a lot of the domestic US UFO sightings. The reason for this is, of course, there was a war going on. Investigating UFOs in the middle of a war when people are shooting at you is not high on the US military's priority list.
Almost 50 years on, specialists have revisited Wayne Dalrymple's eyewitness account in the hope of finally explaining the incident. Among them is Carolyn Crawford, professor of astronomy at the University of Cambridge, who has focused her attention on the strange light in the sky.
There are many things that happen in the night sky that can look odd or unusual to people who are not familiar with what is up there.
But Professor Crawford has found some key elements of Dalrymple's testimony difficult to explain.
As soon as you hear that an object has been seen moving rapidly through the sky, you can immediately discount the idea that it could be due to one of the bright planets. They don't create any rapid motion, and so they can't possibly be the cause. There are, of course, transitory appearances of things that happen in the sky, and, for example, a bit of space rock burning up in our atmosphere as a meteor is a prime example. But, of course, as soon as you hear that an object is changing position in that motion, perhaps zigzagging, that does not fit what we understand from meteors.
If not an astronomical object, could the light in the blackout have been caused by some kind of aircraft? David Higgins is a commercial helicopter pilot and an aviation safety expert. He has studied the Nha Trang case and wonders whether one of America's warplanes could explain the strange light.
The McDonnell Douglas Phantom was certainly an aircraft used during the Vietnam War, and that has two jet engines, both with reheat or afterburners. Now, an afterburner is a system where fuel is actually injected aft of a rear turbine jet engine to produce thrust, and this thrust is either used for takeoff, to achieve supersonic flight, or indeed for aerial combat.
But the glow from a distant afterburner doesn't seem to tally with Dalrymple's report.
The afterburner theory is kind of on hold at that point, because the witnesses also say that the light was very bright and intense.
The description of how bright the light was suggests a different piece of military hardware. Flares.
The fact that eyewitnesses on the ground say that it almost turned like daylight, the fact that the whole area was lit, points initially to the fact that it is some sort of illumination flare to actually illuminate an area of land beneath it.
But even the flare theory is not a perfect match for the light in the sky.
There were several witness reports saying that these objects were actually moving very, very quickly and zigzagging, and that obviously doesn't fall in line how we recognize a flare would behave.
No one solution seems to fit. And no one can explain the blackout on the base, unless the light and the blackout are unrelated.
It's very easy to link things together that are just purely coincidence.
We may never know if the two phenomena were linked, but if so, it would certainly have posed some serious questions for the American military.
I think what will have been in people's minds will have been two things. Firstly, is this just some sort of bizarre equipment malfunction, in which case you need to identify it and rectify it immediately? But of far more concern is the possibility that this was perhaps some sort of weapon.
No weapon capable of the disruption described in Dalrymple's account has ever been documented.
To this day, the Nha Trang sightings remain unexplained.
For Wayne Dalrymple, he's had to accept that what he saw that night may always remain a mystery.
I've never heard of whether any more incidences like that happen in Vietnam or not. I never heard of another one in Vietnam, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. It was just another day in the fun zone.